Kevin arrived at George's house late in the evening, the sun barely visible on the horizon as dusk settled over the quiet neighborhood. They hadn't seen each other in months, so when Kevin suggested stopping by, George eagerly agreed. It had been too long since they had shared a drink and reminisced about old times. They spent the first hour laughing, talking about mutual friends, and catching up on recent events. At one point, George leaned back in his chair, his face full of curiosity. "Hey, by the way," he said, his voice suddenly more serious. "Have you heard from Joseph lately?" Kevin's cheerful demeanor faded immediately. His smile disappeared, replaced by a look of concern, and for a moment, he didn't respond. George noticed the change and leaned in slightly. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. Kevin sighed, staring down at his glass before he spoke. "You don't know, do you?" George's heart skipped a beat. "Know what?" "Joseph died 3 weeks ago," Kevin said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the news. It was under terrible circumstances. A chill crept down George's spine, and for a moment the room felt colder. "What? No, that can't be. I just talked to him a few weeks ago. What happened?" George pressed, his voice rising. Kevin hesitated. "I don't want to go into all the details. Trust me, George, it's not something I like to think about." But George wasn't going to let it go. He shook his head, his voice firm. "Kevin, you have to tell me. Joseph was my friend too. I need to know what happened." Kevin took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. His eyes looked distant, like he was already reliving the events. "Okay," he said, his voice low. "But I'm warning you, George, this isn't some ordinary story. You may not believe it, but everything I'm about to tell you is true, and it still haunts me." George nodded, feeling a mixture of dread and curiosity. "You know I moved recently, right?" Kevin began. "Well, it wasn't just because I wanted a change of scenery. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that village anymore, not after what happened. I was working for the local police back then. It was a small town, nothing much ever happened. Most days, I just sat in the office playing games on my phone. It was winter and the nights were bitter cold." Kevin's voice lowered as he continued. "One evening I fell asleep at the office, only to wake up to complete darkness. It was late, and I decided to head home. The cold was unbearable that night. As I was walking through the village, I noticed something strange. The gate to my neighbor's house was wide open. The lights in the house were on, but no one seemed to be around. At first I thought maybe they'd just forgotten to close the gate, but something didn't feel right. I went inside the yard and called out, but there was no answer. The door was open, so I stepped inside, expecting to see my neighbor, but the house was empty, George, completely empty. I looked around for a while, but I couldn't find anyone." George listened intently, feeling the unease growing within him. "The next day, I reported my neighbor missing," Kevin continued. "We organized a search party. We scoured the entire village, but there was no trace of her. Then we decided to check the forest nearby, thinking maybe she'd wandered off for some reason. Hours passed and we were starting to lose hope, but then one of the search dogs picked up a scent." Kevin paused, his eyes darkening. "We followed the dog to a clearing, and that's when we found it. A pool of blood, fresh blood. And above us, hanging 35 feet up in the branches of a tree, was my neighbor's body. She was impaled on a branch, George. It was like something out of a nightmare. Who could do that? Who could lift a woman that high and impale her like that?" George shuddered, gripping his drink tighter. "That's horrific," he whispered. Kevin nodded, his expression grim. "We buried her the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was happening. Over the next few weeks, strange things started to happen. More people went missing, and every time it was the same, houses left open, no sign of struggle, and the bodies would be found miles away, mutilated, disfigured beyond recognition. Whoever or whatever was doing this wasn't human." George's skin prickled with goosebumps. "What do you mean, not human?" Kevin glanced at him with a look that sent a chill through George. "One night, the villagers decided to take matters into their own hands. They armed themselves with axes and pitchforks, determined to catch whatever was stalking us. I joined them. We set out into the fields, hoping to find some clue, some sign of the killer. Kevin's voice lowered to almost a whisper. It was dark by the time we found my other neighbor's body. His organs were missing, George, completely gone. We were all standing there, trying to figure out what kind of animal could have done this, when one of the flashlights flickered over something in the wheat fields. George's heart pounded as he listened, his hands clammy. "I'll never forget what I saw next," Kevin said, his voice trembling slightly. Out of the bushes came a long, thin, pale creature with long black hair and no eyes. Its mouth was full of sharp, jagged teeth, and it let out this horrible growl that froze us all in place. I've never been so scared in my life. We all ran, George. We ran like hell, but it chased us. George's breath quickened. What was it? I don't know, Kevin admitted. But it wasn't human. It was fast, too. I was the last one to run, and it came after me. I tripped, and I thought it was over. It grabbed me, George. Its hands, they were cold, like death itself. It dug its claws into my shoulder, and I screamed. I thought I was done for. Kevin lifted his shirt, revealing a scar on his shoulder. This is what it did to me. George stared at the scar, his blood running cold. Somehow, I managed to fight it off, Kevin said. I kicked it away and pulled out my pistol. I shot it, and it let out this ear-piercing scream before running off into the woods. I was lucky, but I knew it wasn't over. The next day, I tried to find anything online about creatures like that. All I found were rumors and urban legends, nothing concrete. But one thing stuck out: holy water. Some stories said it could repel creatures like that. Kevin paused, his face tense. I had a jar of holy water at home just in case. I didn't think I'd need it, but that night, I did. George's eyes widened. What do you mean? At around 3 a.m, I woke up to knocking on my window. I heard Joseph's voice calling out to me, "Kevin, open up, it's important." I was half asleep, so I almost opened the door without thinking. But then I saw the hand tapping on the window, and George. It wasn't Joseph's hand, it was the creature. George's heart raced, his palms sweating. It started banging on the door, screaming at me to open up in this horrible, distorted voice. I ran into the kitchen, searching frantically for the jar of holy water. It was ready to break down the door. Just as it started splintering, I found the jar. I poured the holy water into a bottle and flung the window open. I threw the water on it, and it shrieked in pain, running off into the night. Kevin took a deep breath. The next morning, I packed up and left. I quit my job, sold my house, and never looked back. And that same day, I found out Joseph was murdered. George sat in stunned silence, the weight of the story pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say, but the terror in Kevin's voice told him that his friend believed every word. "I don't blame you if you don't believe me," Kevin said finally, his voice weary. "But I swear it's all true." George swallowed hard. "I believe you, Kevin. I don't know what to say." Kevin nodded, a sad smile on his face. "Let's just get some more food and drink, and maybe you should head home before it gets too late." George agreed, but as he glanced at the darkening windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows outside. Daniel squinted through the heavy downpour as his windshield wipers fought an uphill battle against the relentless rain. His GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the last road sign he had passed had been so rusted over that he couldn't make out the words. "Typical," he muttered, frustration mounting as he turned the steering wheel sharply onto a dirt road. He was supposed to meet up with his friends in the nearby village for the weekend, but he was running behind schedule. The rain had hit unexpectedly, slowing everything down. To make up for lost time, he decided to cut through the woods. The road was winding, the visibility near zero as the trees seemed to close in on him. His phone had died earlier, and the cigarette lighter in his old sedan was long broken, so there was no way to charge it. Still, Daniel was confident that the road he was on would take him straight to the village. The plan was simple: meet his friends, hang out for the weekend, and maybe enjoy some peace away from the chaos of the city. But as he drove deeper into the woods, doubt began to gnaw at him. The road narrowed significantly, almost as if it wasn't a road at all, and the trees loomed larger, their branches tangling in eerie shapes above him. He should have reached the village by now. Suddenly, the car lurched violently. Daniel's hands flew to the wheel as the vehicle skidded out of control. The tires hit something slick, and before he could react, the car swerved hard to the right, smashing into a tree. His head slammed against the steering wheel, and then, nothing. When Daniel opened his eyes, the world around him was dim and unfamiliar. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the haze from his mind. He wasn't in his car anymore. Instead, he was lying on a rough, straw-filled mattress, the room dimly lit by a single oil lamp on the bedside table. He sat up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his head. His clothes were damp, and the faint smell of old wood and earth filled the air. The room had a rustic feel, like something out of a period drama: stone walls, wooden furniture, and no sign of modern technology. "Where the hell am I?" he muttered to himself, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His boots were gone, replaced by simple leather slippers. He stood slowly, steadying himself as his head throbbed with every movement. The door creaked open, and Daniel's heart raced as a woman in her 30s entered the room. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her hair tied up in a neat bun, her face serene but strangely cold. "Are you all right?" she asked in a soft voice. Daniel blinked at her. "Yeah, I guess. Where am I?" "You're safe," she said, offering no further explanation. "I need to call my wife," Daniel said. "Do you have a phone?" The woman shook her head. "No, we don't have a phone here. The nearest one is in the city, about 20 kilometers from here." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, no phone? This is a village, right? There has to be some way to contact someone." She simply stared at him, offering a small, apologetic smile. Suddenly, another figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man with a grizzled beard and a stern expression. His clothes were similarly old-fashioned, his face etched with deep lines. "It's better if you stay here tonight," the man said firmly. "I'll drive you to the city in the morning." Daniel frowned. "I can't stay here. My friends are expecting me, and they'll be worried if they don't hear from me. Where's my car?" "Your car is not in working order," the man answered flatly. "Then I'll walk," Daniel said, standing up. "I appreciate the help, but I really need to get going." The man's expression darkened. "It's getting dark. It's dangerous. You won't come back." Something about the man's tone unnerved Daniel, but he didn't care. He wasn't about to spend the night in this strange place, cut off from the rest of the world. "I'll be fine," Daniel said, brushing past them both. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity. The village was unlike anything he had ever seen. It felt like he had stepped back in time. The houses were old and weathered, many of their windows boarded up. A large wooden fence surrounded the perimeter of the village, giving it a feeling of isolation. Everything about the place was unsettling, but Daniel pushed those thoughts aside as he made his way toward the gate. As he approached the large wooden gate, a guard stepped out from the shadows. "Where are you going?" the man growled. His voice was low and menacing. "Don't you know you can't go out in the evening?" "I'm leaving," Daniel said, his patience wearing thin. "I'll be fine." "Let him go," a voice called from behind him. It was the tall man from earlier. "He won't believe it until he sees it for himself." The guard hesitated but stepped aside, pulling open the gate with a heavy groan. Daniel stepped through and began walking down the dirt road that wound through the forest. He could hear the whispers of the villagers behind him, but he ignored them. He was tired, injured, and just wanted to get out of there. As he walked, the road seemed longer than he remembered. The trees on either side of him felt like they were closing in, and the air grew colder with every step. His body ached from the accident, making it difficult to move quickly, but he pressed on. That's when he noticed something. Movement in the trees. At first he thought it was just his imagination, but as he glanced over his shoulder, he saw them. People. At least a dozen figures, shadowy and silent, walking parallel to him through the woods. "What the hell?" Daniel whispered to himself, quickening his pace. The figures continued to follow him, their movements slow but deliberate. They were keeping their distance, but he could feel their eyes on him. Something was very wrong. Daniel started to run, his heart pounding in his chest despite the pain in his legs. But no matter how fast he moved, they kept pace, getting closer and closer. He risked another glance and his stomach churned. These weren't ordinary villagers. Their clothes were tattered, covered in dirt and grime. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide open, unblinking. Scars crisscrossed their skin, and some of them were holding crude weapons, axes, pitchforks, rusted knives. Panic surged through Daniel as he tried to pick up speed, but his injuries slowed him down. He tripped, falling to his knees in the mud. As he scrambled to his feet, one of the figures stepped out of the woods and into the light. The man, if you could call him that, was gnawing on something. It took a moment for Daniel to realize what it was. A human hand. The man chewed it like it was a piece of meat, blood dripping down his chin. The others closed in, their mouths twitching as if trying to speak, but only garbled noises came out. Daniel's vision blurred as adrenaline kicked in. He was surrounded. The cannibalistic villagers were coming for him, and he had no way to escape. Then, out of nowhere, headlights cut through the darkness. A car engine roared, and the villagers froze. Daniel turned to see a battered old truck speeding toward him. It skidded to a halt, and the driver, a man from the village, jumped out, shotgun in hand. "Get in if you want to live," the man shouted, firing off a few rounds to keep the creatures at bay. Without hesitation, Daniel ran to the truck and threw himself inside. The driver slammed on the gas and the truck roared back down the road, leaving the cannibals behind. Daniel's heart pounded as he glanced back at the figures fading into the distance, their hollow eyes staring after him. What were they?" he stammered. The driver's knuckles were white as he gripped the wheel. "You don't want to know. You were lucky. Most don't get a second chance." Daniel sat back in the seat, his head swimming with disbelief. Whatever this village was, whatever horrors lived in those woods, he had barely escaped with his life. And as the truck sped through the darkness, one thing was certain: he would never take a shortcut again. Ethan hadn't returned to his grandmother's house in years. After she passed away, the old cottage in the village had remained abandoned, a relic of his childhood summers when he would spend weeks running through the forests and swimming in the nearby lake. Those were carefree days, filled with the smell of pine needles and the sounds of chirping crickets at night. The house had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary far from the bustling city where Ethan now lived and worked. But recently, the stress of his demanding job and the noise of the city had become too much to bear. He yearned for the peace of the countryside, and the idea of spending a few days at the old cottage seemed like the perfect escape. He pictured himself lounging on the porch, breathing in the fresh air, and taking long walks through the woods. So, on a cool autumn afternoon, he packed his bags and drove out to the village, eager for the tranquility he remembered so fondly. The village was just as he remembered it, though a bit more worn with age. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees that formed a canopy overhead. As he pulled up to the cottage, memories flooded back. The swing on the porch, the old oak tree in the yard, and the scent of the wildflowers that grew untamed in the garden. The house looked smaller than he remembered, but it was still the same cozy haven he had cherished as a child. After unloading his bags, Ethan decided to explore the house. The air inside was musty from disuse, but everything was just as it had been left. Dusty furniture, faded photographs on the walls, and the creaky wooden floors that groaned under his weight. He smiled, feeling a sense of nostalgia wash over him. It was good to be back. As the afternoon sun began to set, Ethan decided to cook himself a simple meal. The smell filled the kitchen, reminding him of those summer nights when his grandmother would cook dinner after a long day of playing outside. He ate on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The world was quiet, save for the distant barking of dogs from a neighboring house. Ethan felt at peace, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. After finishing his meal, he decided to head to bed early. The long drive had worn him out, and the comfort of the old bed was too inviting to resist. He slipped under the heavy blankets, listening to the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the faint barking of dogs. Soon he drifted off to sleep. Ethan was startled awake by the frantic barking of dogs. The sound was closer now, more urgent, echoing through the stillness of the night. He sat up, disoriented, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. The barking continued, relentless and sharp, as if the dogs were warning of some unseen danger. Annoyed, Ethan got out of bed and walked to the window. He peered out into the darkness, expecting to see nothing but the familiar sight of the yard and the fence beyond it. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. He waited for a few moments, listening to the barking, but saw nothing that could explain the commotion. Just some stray animals, he muttered to himself, pulling the curtain shut. He returned to bed, but the unease lingered. It took him a while to fall back asleep, and even then, his dreams were restless. The next day, Ethan decided to explore the surrounding woods. The idea of visiting the lake, where he had spent so many summers, was appealing. It was a short hike through the forest, and he was eager to see if the place was as he remembered. The morning was crisp, with a light fog clinging to the ground as he set off on the familiar path. The forest was just as enchanting as he recalled, with towering trees and the scent of damp earth. He took his time, enjoying the solitude and the quiet rustling of leaves underfoot. As he approached the lake, the memories came flooding back, swimming in the cool water, fishing with his grandfather, and lying on the grassy shore to watch the clouds drift by. The lake was serene, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the sky above. He stood there for a while, lost in thought, before heading back to the cottage. The day passed uneventfully, but the memory of the previous night's disturbance lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he dismissed it as nothing more than the quirks of an old house and his overactive imagination. That night, Ethan was again awakened by the barking dogs. This time, the sound was louder, more frantic, as if the animals were in a state of sheer panic. He groaned, irritated, and pulled the blanket over his head, hoping to block out the noise, but the barking persisted, relentless and piercing. Frustrated, he threw off the blanket and went to the window. His irritation turned to dread when he noticed something strange. There, standing just beyond the fence, was a tall, shadowy figure. It was the outline of a man, impossibly long and thin, dressed in dark clothes. The figure stood motionless, staring directly at him. A cold wave of fear washed over Ethan. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared back, frozen in place. The figure did not move, did not waver, but its presence was unnerving. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan mustered the courage to step back from the window. When he looked again, the figure was gone. He stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps some stranger passing by, but deep down, he knew that what he had seen was real, and it filled him with a deep sense of foreboding. The next morning, Ethan decided to ask the neighbors if they had noticed anything strange the night before. He found Jim, an old man who lived a few houses down, tending to his garden. Jim was a friendly sort, always ready to chat, and Ethan hoped he might have some explanation for the strange figure. "Morning, Jim," Ethan called as he approached. "Morning, Ethan. Long time no see," Jim replied, wiping his hands on his overalls. "What brings you back to the village?" "Just taking a break from the city," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone casual. "Listen, I was wondering, "Did you hear or see anything strange last night? There was a lot of barking, and I thought I saw someone near my place." Jim's expression shifted from friendly to serious. He looked at Ethan with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You don't know, do you?" Jim asked, his voice low. "Know what?" Ethan replied, feeling a chill creep up his spine. Jim hesitated before speaking. "There was a man who lived in this village about 2 years ago. He drowned in the lake, that one in the forest. Folks say his spirit never found peace. They say he wanders the village at night, looking into people's windows. Most of us try to ignore it." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. "That's just a story, right? Some old village ghost tale?" Jim shook his head. "You can believe what you want, but I've seen him. And I'll tell you this, if you see him, don't acknowledge him. Just go back to bed and ignore him." Ethan forced a laugh, trying to mask his growing unease. "Sounds like something to scare kids with." Jim didn't laugh. He just gave Ethan a long, hard look before returning to his gardening. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Ethan left, feeling more unsettled than ever. The idea of a ghost wandering the village at night seemed ridiculous, but the fear he had felt the previous night was real. He couldn't shake the image of that dark figure standing by the fence, watching him. That night, Ethan struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house and every rustle of the wind outside made his heart race. He lay in bed wide awake, waiting for the barking to start again. And when it did, it was louder and more frenzied than ever before. The dogs were howling, barking as if in terror. Ethan felt a surge of anger. This had gone on long enough. He wasn't going to let some ghost story or shadowy figure ruin his time here. He got out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and marched to the window. The figure was in his garden on this time, standing and looking towards Ethan. Tall, dark, and silent. It seemed to be waiting for him. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, but his anger overpowered his fear. "I'm sick of this," Ethan muttered under his breath. He threw open the door and stormed out into the yard, bat in hand. The figure didn't move as Ethan approached. It just stood there, staring at him with what seemed like hollow eyes. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he shouted at the figure. The figure remained silent, its presence oppressive and unnatural. Ethan gripped the bat tighter, raising it as a threat. "Get out of here or I'll hit you," he warned. The figure still did not move. Anger and fear boiled over in Ethan, and he swung the bat with all his might. But before it could make contact, the figure's hand shot out, catching the bat in midair. Ethan gasped as the figure held the bat effortlessly, then squeezed it with such force that the wood splintered and broke in two. Ethan stumbled back, staring in horror at the figure. This was no ordinary man. No man could do something like that. The figure stepped closer, its face finally illuminated by the pale moonlight. Ethan's blood ran cold as he saw the grotesque features. A skull-like visage, with patches of rotting flesh clinging to it, and one eye hanging loosely from its socket. The figure's mouth twisted into a ghastly grin, revealing teeth that were sharp and uneven. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure reached out a bony hand toward him.
"Give me your Duma,"
it rasped, in a voice that was more like a hiss, inhuman and cold. What are you?" Ethan stammered, backing away in terror.
"Your Duma."
The figure repeated, its voice growing harsher.
"Give it to me."
Ethan had no idea what it was asking for, but every instinct screamed at him to get away. He turned and bolted back to the house, slamming the door behind him. He could hear the figure outside, moving closer, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Ethan ran through the house, his mind racing. The figure was no longer outside, it was inside, coming for him. He could hear the doors being rattled, the windows being pounded on. Desperation clawed at him. He knew he couldn't stay here. He needed to escape. He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter and ran to the garage, which was connected to the house. He could hear the figure breaking through the front door as he started the car. Without hesitation, he slammed on the gas, crashing through the garage door and speeding out into the night. The fence splintered as he drove through it, not daring to look back. Ethan didn't stop driving until he was miles away from the village, his hands trembling on the wheel. His mind was a blur of fear and disbelief. What had he seen? Was it real? The memory of the figure, its grotesque face, and the inhuman voice haunted him. He didn't return to the cottage. In fact, he never set foot in that village again. As soon as he reached the city, he put the house up for sale. He didn't care about the memories it held. He couldn't live with the terror it now represented. Ethan eventually moved to a new place, far from the village, far from the memories of that night. Ethan was finally able to find peace in his new big house, where he could rest from the horror and stress he had endured.